Did you know that Queen Nzinga sold her people into slavery? You thought she cared about them, but she sat on the back of her servant during negotiations because Portuguese colonizers refused to give her a chair. This same queen would go on to fight European powers for over 40 years, and has been honored in Angola for almost 400 years. But what drove Queen Nzinga to such extremes? Why did her own brother take away her child? How did she manage to outsmart not just the Portuguese, but also play European powers against each other? And was she really the freedom fighter that history celebrates? Or is her story more complicated than we've been told? Queen Nzinga was born around 1583 into the royal family of Ndongo, in what we now call Angola. Her father, King Kilonji, ruled during one of the most dangerous periods in African history, the height of the Atlantic slave trade. From childhood, Nzinga watched Portuguese raiders tear apart her kingdom. They would attack villages, capture entire families, and ship them across the ocean to work on sugar plantations in Brazil. This reality shaped her understanding of what Europeans really wanted from Africa. But the real betrayal came from her own family. When her father died, her brother Mbandi took the throne. You'd expect family loyalty, especially during such dangerous times. Unfortunately, Mbandi saw his sister as a threat to his power rather than an ally in the fight for survival. So he ordered the execution of Nzinga's infant son. This wasn't just murder, it was a calculated move to eliminate any future claims to the throne. But he didn't stop there. Mbandi had Nzinga forcibly sterilized to make sure she could never have children again. Imagine the pain of losing your child and then having your ability to create life stolen from you by your own brother. This family trauma taught Nzinga something that would define her entire reign: never trust anyone completely, not even those closest to you. If her own brother could betray her so brutally, what could she expect from Portuguese colonizers who saw Africans as nothing more than cargo? Her brother thought he was eliminating a rival, but instead, he created one of history's most formidable opponents to European colonization. Eventually, Mbandi's weakness as a leader became obvious to everyone. The Portuguese continued their raids, the kingdom lost territory, and the people suffered. By 1622, things had gotten so bad that Mbandi was forced to send someone to negotiate with the Portuguese governor in Luanda. That someone was Nzinga. When Nzinga arrived at the Portuguese settlement of Luanda in 1622, she walked into what was supposed to be a diplomatic meeting. But the Portuguese had other ideas about how this negotiation would go. The governor had arranged the meeting room with a single chair which was his own. Nzinga was expected to stand throughout the negotiations like a servant receiving orders from her master. It was a deliberate insult to show who had power in the room. Most African leaders might have accepted this humiliation to avoid conflict. After all, the Portuguese had superior weapons, control of coastal trade, and alliances with other European powers. Standing during negotiations seemed like a small price to pay for peace. But Nzinga wasn't most leader. Without saying a word, she gestured to one of her attendants. The woman immediately got down on her hands and knees, and Nzinga sat on her back as if she were a throne. She did the entire negotiation from this position, speaking to the Portuguese governor as an equal. Nzinga destabilized the Portuguese. They had tried to make her feel small, but instead, she had turned their power game against them. She got the Portuguese to agree to return captured territories to Ndongo, then secured the release of her sister, who had been held captive in Luanda, and negotiated trading rights that would benefit her kingdom rather than just enriching Portuguese merchants. But that was just the beginning. She made her brother look insignificant by establishing herself as someone the Portuguese would have to take seriously in all future dealings. The chair incident became legendary because it captured something essential about resistance. Sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a sword or a gun, it's the refusal to be diminished by those who think they're superior to you. Unfortunately, the Portuguese had no intention of honoring the treaty they had just signed. Within months, they resumed their slave raids with even greater intensity than before. This betrayal taught Nzinga another crucial lesson. Europeans would never honor agreements with Africans unless forced to do so through superior strength. But there was a big problem: fighting the Portuguese alone was impossible. They had too many resources, too many weapons, and too many allies. But she learned something that most African leaders missed. Europeans were not united in their colonial ambitions. Portugal and the Netherlands were bitter rivals, competing for control of global trade routes and colonial territories. When Dutch forces captured Luanda from the Portuguese in 1641, most African leaders probably viewed this as just one group of white colonizers replacing another. But Nzinga recognized it as a chance to play European powers against each other. She immediately reached out to the Dutch West India Company and proposed an alliance. The Dutch would get access to trade routes and natural resources. In exchange, they would provide Nzinga with advanced European weapons, military training, and soldiers to fight against the Portuguese. The alliance worked better than anyone expected. With Dutch weapons and military support, Nzinga's forces began winning battles against the Portuguese for the first time in decades. She reclaimed territories that had been lost for years. At one point, Nzinga and her Dutch allies laid siege to major Portuguese strongholds and controlled key parts of both Ndongo and Matamba. For several years, it looked like she might actually drive the Portuguese out of the region entirely. But European politics are never simple, and alliances based on convenience rarely last forever. The Dutch decided that their war with Portugal was too expensive to continue in 1648. Without consulting Nzinga or considering what this would mean for their African ally, they negotiated a separate peace agreement with the Portuguese and withdrew from Angola. It gets even worse. As part of their peace deal with Portugal, the Dutch essentially abandoned Nzinga to face Portuguese retaliation alone. Nzinga had built her entire military strategy around Dutch support, and now that support was gone overnight. But by this point, Nzinga had learned to always have a backup plan. During her years of alliance with the Dutch, she had established control over key trade routes and built up economic reserves through her participation in the slave trade. When the Dutch withdrew, she ran to her stronghold in Matamba, but she was far from defeated. Eventually, this strategic thinking would pay off in ways that even Nzinga might not have expected. Cause while she spent decades fighting against Portuguese efforts to enslave her people, Nzinga herself actively participated in the slave trade. She captured enemies in war, took prisoners during raids, and sold them to European traders in exchange for weapons and wealth. This creates a moral contradiction that could be hard for people to understand. How can someone be celebrated as a freedom fighter when they enslaved others? The answer isn't simple, and it shows the impossible choices that colonization forced on African leaders. By the 1600s, the Atlantic slave trade had become so central to West and Central African economies that no kingdom could completely avoid it. European demand for enslaved people had created a system where African rulers had to choose between participating in slavery or watching their own people be conquered and enslaved by neighbors who participated. Nzinga chose to engage with this system on her own terms rather than become its victim. When she captured enemies in war, particularly those who had collaborated with the Portuguese against her kingdom, she sold them into slavery. When she needed weapons to defend her territory, she exchanged captives for guns. When she required funding for her military campaigns, she used profits from slave trading to pay her soldiers. This wasn't moral weakness or hypocrisy. It was a survival strategy in a world where European colonization had made traditional African political and economic systems impossible to maintain. Think about it this way: if Nzinga had refused to participate in the slave trade entirely, she would have lacked the resources to resist Portuguese colonization. Her kingdom would have been conquered, and her entire population would have faced enslavement or death. Unfortunately, this moral complexity is exactly what makes Nzinga's story so powerful and so relevant to understanding how colonization actually worked. European powers didn't just conquer Africa through military force. They restructured African economies and political systems in ways that forced African leaders to make terrible choices in order to survive. Nzinga's participation in slavery shows us how colonization corrupted traditional African societies from within, creating systems where freedom for some required the enslavement of others. But it also shows us something else. Even within these impossible circumstances, some African leaders found ways to maintain independence and resist total domination. And nearly 400 years after her death in 1663, Queen Nzinga's influence reaches far beyond Angola in ways that might surprise you. In modern Angola, she's known as the Mother of Angola and appears on the country's paper money. Her image is carved into monuments in the capital city of Luanda. Schools and institutions across the country bear her name. Angolan children learn about her resistance to Portuguese colonization as a source of national pride and inspiration. Eventually, even the Portuguese recognized her effectiveness. In 1656, they negotiated a peace treaty that officially recognized Nzinga's rule over Matamba and allowed Portuguese traders to operate in her territory only under her terms and conditions. This was a diplomatic victory for Angola that acknowledged her as an equal partner rather than a conquered subject. But her legacy extends far beyond her era. Modern African feminists claim Nzinga as proof that strong female leadership has deep historical roots in African culture. A woman who commanded armies, negotiated with world powers, and maintained independence for 4 decades doesn't fit into what African women were allowed to do in the past. In recent years, Nzinga's story has reached global audiences through the 2023 Netflix series African Queens, Nzinga. The show sparked new international interest in African history and introduced her story to viewers who had never heard of this remarkable leader. Her guerrilla warfare tactics, strategic thinking and ability to use difficult terrain, mobile forces, and local knowledge to defeat technologically superior enemies became a model for anti-colonial fighters from Algeria to Zimbabwe. This and other African war tactics that turned global are covered in this video.